Well, class, here we are. We've finished up chapter 11a on the Reformation, but now we're going to finish the second part and talk about the Counter-Reformation. Right, the big question we're going to ask ourselves is, how did the Catholic Church respond? Right, we've talked about the Reformers, the different types of reform. We got the Anabaptists, the Zwinglians, the Lutherans, etc. But what did the Catholic Church do? Did they just sit around and say, "Well, that's cool. A lot of people are leaving the church," or did they go to war? Were they passive? It depended maybe on where you're at, but that's the question we're going to look at today. What was the Catholic Church's response? Did they concede anything to the Reformers? So the Reformation, or the aftermath, the response of what we could call it in some ways the empire of the church. If you're familiar with Star Wars, the empire is going to strike back, right? So the Catholic Church isn't going to sit on their hands and let the reformers just be comfortable and content. They are going to ask a lot of questions, and they're going to try to get to the bottom of what this Reformation thing is all about. So, as far as politically speaking, the response, right, of Charles V, specifically of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, where Luther actually kind of lived, once he dealt with some foreign problems with Turks and Muslims, etc., started to fight, and there was a lot of civil war, not just in Germany, but in parts of Italy and France, and really all around Europe, over Luther's teaching. But after a long period of conflict, remember Luther nailed his 95 Theses back in 1517. Finally, in 1555, at the Peace of Augsburg, so again, this is several decades later, this principle was set forth. Charles V was tired of fighting. He realized that war was not benefiting him, his empire, and so the compromise he made, the Peace of Augsburg, was this. It's Seus regio, heus religio. The idea is here is, as the one who reigns, regio or regent, so goes the religion. And we see the words regio and religion, the one who reigns and religion. And the idea, what this meant, right, was that it was the right of a ruler to choose the religion of the people. So if you live, in kind of some of these still feudal societies that are part of the empire, if you're prince or if you're duke or if you're king or queen, if they said, "I'm Catholic," then if you lived in that realm, you needed to be Catholic. If they said, "We want to be Lutheran," you needed to be Lutheran. If you wanted to be Zwinglian or Calvinist or Anabaptist, whatever it was, you had to do within reason. Actually, they didn't grant much freedom to the Anabaptists, actually. But you had to conform to your leader. Now, that sounds maybe a little odd to us today, who are used to, right, religious liberty, freedom of religion and practice. But this was the justification. This was the mindset in the medieval time, right, in the late Middle Ages and part of the Reformation. Um, there was an assumption, and this is according to Kagan in your textbook. He assumed there was an assumption that a state would not be politically stable unless all its citizens conformed to the same religion. Remember, for them, right, the relationship between church and state was so strong that they felt that you couldn't be a stable and strong feudal state or nation unless you had the same religion. And so you kind of see the compromise that eventually came out. Then you have to ask yourself, would you be content with that, or would you want more change, more freedom like we have in America today? Well, at the time, you didn't. So, like we said, we're going to talk about the Catholic Reformation. So, within the church, that's the political response. But within the church itself, how did the Catholic Church respond? Um, well, first of all, there was a group founded by a guy named Ignatius of Loyola, right, this priest, and he founded a famous sect, or a famous group of monks, a group in the church known as the Jesuits, right, the soldiers of Jesus, or the soldiers of Christ. And these are your radical Catholics, if you will. They did a ton of missionary works. They traveled right all over the world. They came to the Americas, they moved to Asia, and they said, we're going to spread Catholicism to counter this Protestant movement that's out there. And they, some of them were involved in the Inquisition, which, again, Protestants aren't a big fan of. But again, the idea is they were zealous. You might say that they were wrong, but the reality is their influence has been huge, even down to universities today, right? There's still a Society of the Jesuits, right? And there's colleges, right, all over even the United States that were founded by the Jesuits. For example, Rockhurst is a pretty prestigious college down in Kansas City, Missouri, and founded by the Jesuits. So the Council of Trent, right, and this met. This was not just a get together for a month or a week and have a little council. The Council of Trent stretched from 1545 to 1563. So they met off and on, right, between wars and conflicts and heading back home to get more information. But this council was formed basically to say, how do we respond to the doctrines that are being taught in the Reformation? Um, and as you Wells especially noticed this, not so much Kagan, but the council was dominated by the Italians and the Pope, right? And so this is the really conservative seat of the Catholic Church, the capital of the Catholic Church, if you will. And so some of the fringe territories, right, where they're still Catholic, weren't necessarily as clearly represented, and some of them may have been more willing to compromise than those who actually attended the council. All right, they made a few practical, clerical, and social reforms, which we're going to talk about here on the next slide. But for all intents and purposes, and this is what frustrates Protestants down today and say, see, this is why we had to have a Reformation, was that they made, after all their studying and all their debate, zero major doctrinal concessions. They continued to maintain, right, a scholastic education. Well, that's okay. But they continued to teach a doctrine of works. They continued to uphold the authority of tradition, right, as equal with the Word of God. They continued to say they're not just two sacraments like Luther argued, but there are seven. They continue to argue for transubstantiation. They said the Eucharist, right, at this time, and this is going to change later, but was not for the lay people. Priests continued to need to be celibate. They couldn't be married. They continued to say that purgatory does exist, that it was okay to sell indulgences, and that it was all right to continue to venerate saints, relics, and sacred images, right? And you can visit, for example, you can go downtown to one of the cathedrals here in Dubuque, and you can go and see actually the bones of saints and martyrs of people of the past that are venerated, and the people travel to see. So the social significance, right? They didn't make doctrinal concessions, which again frustrated the Protestants, but they did make some changes, some alterations. For example, they began to tax the clergy. So they said, it makes sense. The church shouldn't be this kind of fully separate organism altogether. They ought to be taxed as well, right? We don't want greed in the church. They started to make some cuts in the number of clergy and altered some religious observances. They, in some places, not many, but in some, they actually, especially more towards the north, said it was okay to deliver Mass in the vernacular. It's okay to teach and actually maybe even give people access to the Scriptures. So this is slow going, but over time, the Catholic Church said, yeah, it's okay for people to have the Bible for themselves. As far as the role of laity, they did add some increased privilege and responsibility within the Church, but again, no major changes. And this is, again, really fascinating, that by the end of the 16th century, so within the first 100 years of the Protestant Reformation, approximately, and again, you're going to get different numbers on this, somewhere between probably a third and a half of all the converts to Protestant religions or Protestant denominations went back to the Catholic Church. Again, there's probably personal reasons, there's political reasons, there was political pressure, but the reality is, after considering it, quite a few returned to the Catholic Church. So the big question, right? How did the Catholic Church respond? Well, I'm curious to find out this week what your thoughts are. Did they do a good job? Did they do enough? Should they have done way more? Are they the evil Catholics that some people speak of today? And that's what we'll be discussing this week. But I wanted to ask a couple other quick questions too, right? So as we were wrapping up here, we've talked about positive and negative consequences of the Reformation, but did the Reformation go far enough? And this is an interesting thing, right? We're very thankful, and we're taught to be, and I'm not in any way going to discourage anyone from celebrating the Reformation. I do. I'm very thankful. I'd rather celebrate that than Halloween on October 31st. At the same time, while I wouldn't want to debate with any of the Reformers, there are those who, a few centuries later, when they were reflecting on the emphasis of the Reformation, they said, okay, it was good. It was necessary. It really supported the doctrine of salvation by grace through faith. But they said maybe it didn't go quite far enough. Let me give you a couple examples here. William R. Newell, in a devotional anthology probably called None But the Hungry Heart, he said, the Reformation, for all its rise from Rome, to this day has never really gotten off the ground. Now he's writing in the late 1800s. He said almost all the theology of the various creeds of Christendom dates back to the Reformation, which went triumphantly, he says, to the end of Romans 5. And so far as theological development or presentation of the truth was concerned, stopped there. Now another right thought here is, and this is Miles Stanford. He's the one who put together the devotional anthology called "None But the Hungry Heart." He says here the birth truths of Romans 1 through 5 are not meant for our spiritual growth. They're important, right? They're foundational. Romans 1 through 5 gets everybody lost. It shows us that none are righteous, right? That we all fall short of God's standard, and that we're saved by grace through faith. And in reading this, right, where Luther and others said, this is it. This is what I've been missing. But he says the growth truths of Romans 6 to 8. Romans 6, right, that we are buried, we are crucified with Christ, that we are raised to newness of life with him. Chapter 7, we still have to deal with the flesh. It's been dealt with, but it's still there. And so we need Romans chapter 8 to walk in the Spirit. This idea here, he says the ideas of Romans 6 to 8 are presented for our spiritual development and maturity. He says the Reformation brought back the birth truths, but the cross and the life truths are necessary for our growth. And one other quote here, right, this is, I'll tell you who in a second. It's by Andrew Murray, again, writing in the late 1800s. He says, so many rest content with the thought that their sins are pardoned and that they are in the path of life, but know nothing of a personal attachment to the risen Lord Jesus Christ as their life, or of faith that lives in the invisible and walks with the Father. And what he's saying is, we know Christ was crucified for us, but we don't know and we don't understand that we are crucified with Christ. He goes on, the power of the world, the spirit of its literature, and temptations of business and pleasure all unite, he says, to make up a religion in which it is sought to combine a comfortable hope for the future with the least possible amount of sacrifice in the present. And what he's arguing here, right, they're not saying that the Reformation was a terrible thing or we wish they didn't happen, but their concern is there was so much focus on justification by faith that there wasn't a focus on, okay, now what does it look like once you're saved? What does it mean to not continue to walk under the law? What does it mean to not continue to walk according to the old rules and the old way and to become legalistic? But instead, what does it mean? Right, glad we're saved, but are we willing to focus on Christ, take up our cross daily, follow him, and walk in the Spirit, right? And be aware that that's our hope. Right, that's our power, and without the Spirit, right, the fruit of the Spirit, we are bound for trouble. So my encouragement to you as a class, I love talking about the Reformation. I'm thankful for the Reformation. Again, not critical overall of what they did. I'm very thankful. But press on. Know Romans 1 through 5. Own it. And then keep going. Read Romans 6 through 8. In fact, read all of Romans, right? Read all of the scriptures. And ask the Lord to make it clear how they all apply so that we all grow in our relationship with Jesus Christ. So I will sign off now, and hopefully you enjoy chapter 11. Next chapter, we'll be talking about religious war and conflict that arose because of the Reformation. Take care.